Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. This episode is about self-deception and the conspiracy of optimism that occurs within military headquarters and their commanders, with Charles Vandepeer. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
Researchers categorise people, military ones in particular, in a variety of ways. There's a notable pattern though. Senior officers that I meet can be generally split into two factions: those that genuinely seek out challenge for their views, and a group that say they want it but absolutely do not. It will come as little surprise to those in the military that the latter group is substantially larger than the former. Indeed, commanders and officers who actually try to find people who disagree with their policies, practices and views, to challenge them and sharpen their minds, their approaches and their tactics, those are few and far between. In a military force, the power-distance relationship is the highest of any other organisation or institution, and navies sit at the top of that pyramid. That power-distance relationship is one that describes how individuals view authority and an unequal distribution of power. When captains of warships have traditionally had power of life or death over crew, often the oldest and most experienced person on board, and have themselves grown up in that culture, it's not difficult to see why such metrics arise. But it also makes them the least likely to seek, and certainly not relish, challenge. And also why internal challenge doesn't work particularly well in doing anything but affirming the conventional view. But there's another factor that skews the military psyche: a culture of self-deception and a conspiracy of optimism. I came across an article written in War on the Rocks back in 2019, and I thought it worth bringing to your attention. I could have just posted it on social media, but it was good. I mean, really good, and worthy of much more than simple signposting. So I reached out to the author and asked him to come speak about his findings. Dr Charles Vandepeer is a senior academic in intelligence and national security at Charles Stuart University in Australia. Charles's career has included service in the Royal Australian Air Force as an intelligence officer, gaining operational experience on deployments to the Middle East. Prior to joining the Air Force, he served in the Australian Army Reserve. Charles has also worked as a civilian defence operations research scientist and was an adjunct fellow at the University of Oklahoma's Centre for Intelligence and National Security. He has spoken and published on intelligence analysis, military history, operations research, question asking, critical thinking and decision making. Charles, welcome to the show. Let's start with the basics. When I say conspiracy of optimism, it became a popular phrase in Europe, particularly in the UK, as academics started using the phrase about military procurement back in around 2012. But your article referred to this in a different way, or using procurement as only one aspect. So what's the central thesis of that article and your research and finding at that stage?
Peter, look, thanks for having me, and thanks for reaching out. I guess it's always a timely topic because it doesn't go away. And I guess that was the central theme of what I was looking at. The context, I guess, that I led with was that it was actually a Minister of Defence in Australia who used the quote, conspiracy of optimism, when describing back in the 2000s advice that he was getting from the most senior officers in the Australian Defence Force. And that was in relation to Australia was looking at replacing our ageing F-111 fleet with JSF or F-35s out of the States. And he was being assured that there wouldn't be any issue getting JSFs into service. Looking at 2012 was the time frame. And from what he knew, thought that the timing was just not going to be achievable in any way, shape or form. And he was proved correct. So he went against the advice of the senior military officers in the Australian Defence Force and went ahead and, to fill a gap in our, aviation security for the country, went ahead and procured 24 Super Hornets. And sure enough, they reached FOC, which is final operational capability, in 2012. We didn't have the JSFs as he'd anticipated by then, and the F-111s had been retired in 2010. So I guess by ignoring the advice he was getting, but I guess he was concerned that he just kept on getting positive advice, that everything was going to be okay, and it clearly wasn't. And he spoke about that on a couple of occasions. And I guess that got me interested in, and again, it's a quote, conspiracy of optimism. When your Minister of Defence is using it, you know there's probably some issues. So look, my background is as a military intelligence officer, and we, military intelligence, look at opponents. We look at what their capabilities are, what they say they can do, what they can actually do, what they can bring to a fight, and make assessments and judgments on that. I guess the challenge as, serving military officer is then you start to look at your own side and go, well, hang on a second, if they're making these claims as Red Force, what is Blue Force doing? And you see this as a trend. And I start with a quote from Lieutenant Eyre, who was one of the British survivors out of the expedition into Afghanistan back in the 1840s. And he actually went on to write a book. I mean, the British forces were slaughtered as they made their way back through the Hindu Kush, notably with one survivor. He'd been captured earlier, so he survived. And his observation was, look, despite the situation on the ground in Kabul, the senior officers were going with their wishes, not with facing the reality on the ground. And he said, basically, it was going to be a fearful lesson that would teach them that you can't base operations on your wishes. And of course, that, picking up that story at the time, back in 2019, we were looking at Afghanistan and what was going on there. And I think lots of people had already raised issues. And in the article, I've drawn a lot of sources where we just had this overly positive reporting. And it wasn't just Afghanistan. And in the article, I talk about experiences in Iraq with the British military reporting in Iraq that have been picked up and focused on, where you had the Prime Minister rocking up in the early days of Iraq and senior leaders to find the situation on the ground was very different for what has been reported. And there's this filter system because there was motivation, this self-deception. And Barton Whaley described it as motivated misperception, can see but won't. And because there's that motivation towards we've got to, in the Iraq case, we've got to hand over security to the Iraqi forces. It's placing a lot of strain on the British military, so we need to get out. So what happens is that the news from the ground up, which is, hey, things aren't going well, gets filtered the higher it goes to the point where it's, well, actually things are positive. So you take a positive perspective. And this is an ancient problem that militaries have had. This is not new. And so it's not hard to find evidence of that across wars. And in this case, World War I, I drew on Churchill making the observation that it wasn't even necessarily the most senior officer who was looking for positive spin. It was the perception that the positive spin was the way that it should be reported up, that people wanted to report positively so that that's the way to get promoted. That's what people want to hear. And this motivated misperception going up, even if it turns out that the people at the senior levels might want ground truth, by the time it gets to them, it's usually been filtered so much that what they're hearing is far too overly positive a perspective on the situation.
Now, critiques would say, surely, that a can-do attitude in military organisations is the thing that makes the impossible possible. That the spirit of the fighting man is able to carry it forward. That's something to be celebrated. It's something that we should talk about. It's very positive. But the can-do attitude is something very different from this idea of a conspiracy of optimism. The can-do attitude, obviously, it often acknowledges the gritty impossibility of what they're facing on the ground, and despite that goes on and does it. That's not about a conspiracy of optimism at all. I mean, the two things aren't related, surely.
No, so when you look at it, the can-do attitude is something that is, hopefully built into militaries, is hopefully built in at the ground up, because what's often asked is quite difficult against a living, breathing, thinking, fighting opponent. So that positive approach of we have to overcome those barriers, we have to overcome those challenges to take the objective to achieve the mission. That's very much, you have to have that positive attitude going forward. But that's very different to denying reality to get there. And I think you see that when you look at, particularly, I guess, at the coalface groups like Special Forces who deal in the reality of, this might go wrong. we have to actually do it. There's the can-do approach. How do we make it happen? How do we actually do it? With that realistic basis of we've actually got an opponent that we have to deal with. And I think the challenge is the higher up you go, the more divorced from that immediate threat to life. You see this almost a divorce from the reality to expectations and that positive expectations and that positive spin. And so I think that's where the problem starts. And it is a problem because the bigger the gap between your expectations and the reality, the greater the chance for shock. And so one of the authors, and I do encourage people to look at this, Marc Bloch, who is a French army officer and then member of the resistance, who had actually been an army officer in World War One and then World War Two for the weeks that the French army lasted against the German onslaught. And after the French had collapsed, he actually went and looked at and wrote a book called Strange Defeat, actually analysing what on earth happened. Why did France collapse so quickly when on paper they were the stronger military force? And he is very honest in that book and provides some really good insights into this disconnect at the senior level between their expectations and the reality of a fast-moving German blitzkrieg, which he also points out. The Germans had taken Poland some 8 months before, so that French actually had a model, and the English had this model of how the Germans could well fight, which they moved quickly with armour at speed. And yet they hadn't used that intervening period to try and close that gap between expectations and the reality of how the Germans were fighting. And Bosch describes a scene, or multiple scenes, but there's one scene that he describes where there's a French general just staring at a map in a headquarters, unable to comprehend the speed of the Germans, unable to make any reasoned decision, and simply just stunned the leadership at the top, unable to support the troops who were doing the fighting at the ground because they'd simply been outthought. So I think that's where the problem is. I think there are aspects of that can-do military attitude that are so important for overcoming tremendous odds and fighting through. But there has to be a narrowing of that gap between that over-optimism that we see so often and the reality of this is going to be a hard fight. And yeah, we can do it, but we're going to have to deal in the reality of a living, breathing, fighting adversary.
It's interesting. As you talk, I'm reflecting on, both you and I have worked in headquarters in the Middle East during those periods. And I remember just in 2003, 2004, there was a sense that things were not going well. We thought we'd done okay, but we knew there were some underlying problems that were sort of emerging. The transitions and all that sort of stuff that was going on. And yet that sort of texture, the context of that rarely got reported up to higher headquarters, right? As you say, they got filtered out. Sat in a brigade headquarters, it was really interesting. The command brief would sit down and we'd say one thing and then you read what was reported up to M&D Southeast, and then what was getting passed up and assessed reps from M&D Southeast to both Baghdad and both to the UK headquarters as well, and the other component commanders. And you're thinking, this is not reflective of what we're hearing. It's very different. The language, and you and I both understand, as most of the audience will, military language, it didn't translate. It wasn't like, no, we're doing it in a more subtle way. It just wasn't reported. And I found that a very peculiar way that military headquarters worked in terms of those filters. The commanders heard this stuff, but they deemed it not worthy to report up, or it hadn't reached a catalyst for them to say anything. I always found that very strange. Was that your experience as well?
And so I guess my concern is that, and I make this point in the article, most organisations actually know what's going wrong. So people in organisations, whether it's military, whether it's civilian organisations where things go wrong, people in the organisations know and will often attempt to report it and put it forward and get it up the chain. And so I think that's always a problem in that the information is there, but it's not necessarily acceptable, or where there's a need to demonstrate progress and put a positive perspective on it. The information's there, so you pick the most positive source of information, and that simply reinforces that. So that would be my perspective and my observation on that, the information exists, it just gets filtered as it goes up with the expectation that people want to hear something that's far more positive. And yet people on the ground know the situation. One of the challenges, I guess, is in assessing those things is what are the measures that you use? And, Vietnam, we saw body counts used as a measure. There were similar things potentially in Afghanistan. And the problem is in selecting these measures, that can be one of the ways that the information gets filtered. But if you look at something like freedom of movement as a measure, people aren't travelling around in open-top cars freely going wherever they want to or need to. They are going heavily defended, bodied up in body armour, in convoys with all guns and overwatch going on, which is telling you that how do we measure that? That's probably telling us something. We don't have freedom of movement, which tells us that the situation's actually pretty bad. But I think an efforts from the top, and there can be efforts from the top to try and get that information up. But it's very individually based. And as you talked about at the outset, there are some people who genuinely want and actively seek out that information. But for the most part, it gets filtered out because everybody's busy and running around trying to get stuff done and potentially fight the fight as well. I think one of the challenges is that when things are busy, there's that reluctance to ask questions internally. And it's that we don't have time for questions, so let's move on. Well, the problem is if you don't have time for questions, then you really don't have time for thinking. And I think, and one of your listeners might correct me, but I reckon it was Boyd who, in one of his lengthy and insightful slide packs, talks about trying to get an adversary where they are so internally focused on processes and putting so much time and effort into making their own systems work that they forget about the adversary outside. And I think that is one of the challenges. You want to impose that on an adversary, but the problem is, well, what if you're imposing that on yourself? And so this internal focus takes away from, hey, what's actually going on and what's the reality of the situation? I had a discussion years ago with a British former army officer, then operations analyst, and he made the point, he said he was concerned because he'd seen over his career, which had included service in the first Gulf War, he said he'd seen a shift in assessments on exercise and activities from assessing how people thought to assessing adherence to a process. And I think that focus on a process takes away from that critical thinking and that asking questions. And sometimes it's the simplest questions from somebody coming outside and saying, why is this going on? What's happening? But if there's no openness to those questions because people are too busy or there's this unwritten, and it's usually unwritten, expectation for positive reporting, then it gets missed.
I'm struck by a number of things there, which I want to come back to, particularly thinking time. But I would say that surely there are times where, and you raise this in the article, that a heavily process-based organisation like the UK military in the 1980s, very focused on process, set staff procedures, set orders process, set cascade of advice and orders coming down from the top and going up from the bottom. And then you get to the Falklands, which is notable for its difference in how it was commanded, run, and its acceptance of the deep level of change. There was no conspiracy of optimism or self-denial of those who went down south in 1982. This wasn't the Soviets, but this was a really, really tough fight. But it wasn't a organisation that had been defeated or honed or was specifically ready for this type of organisation. It's a really interesting part of a group of people who grew up in the Cold War, who were under very formalised orders process and yet approached the Falklands campaign in a very different way.
Looking at that and what I've read and researched on it, it did look like, because it was so different and because it was so far away and because they had been caught, British government, British military were surprised by the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands. I think there was that level of reality, an undeniable reality. If we're going to take this back, this is going to be a really difficult fight at the furthest reaches of what we can do. And I think that from the outset really, I guess, guided and informed and shaped the thinking that it was so unexpected and such a different fight. And I mean, they really had very little intelligence on the Argentinians to start with, because it had been a surprise and because it was such a different fight, that they went in knowing it was going to be a big challenge. And I think that helped ground it in reality. I think in that case, you saw the avoidance of that over-optimism bias, because it was going to be such a tough effort, even to pull together a force and get down there. It was difficult. And then as they went down there and taking losses early in terms of ships and challenges, it was difficult. And I think that really kept it quite grounded in the reality of we're not over-optimistic because there is the chance we might lose. And I think when I wrote the article, the US had just put out their defence strategy. And what was encouraging in that defence strategy at the time was, I think the line was, the US has no preordained right to win in a future conflict. And I think it's those realistic statements, and it's trying to push people towards there are no guarantees of victory. And when you start looking at that, and when you start asking tough questions, and what happens if we do not win, that is a realistic possibility, as opposed to certainly the Australian attitude of, she'll be right, it'll be okay. I think there's a lot more of that questioning going on today. So I think that's been a positive. But I think where there's a difficult fight, particularly unexpected and conceptually different and doctrinally different, it wasn't in the case of the Falklands fighting the Soviets. This was something that had not really been anticipated or expected, and it was going to be difficult. That's why you saw, I think, that realistic perspective. And I think you see that, and there's a number of cases. And even in broader conflicts where you have issues where there might be, in some cases, a denial of reality or that over-optimism, despite things not going well, there will still be pockets in there of groups that go, actually, hang on, things aren't going well. So I think within broader militaries, you can see groups and areas that go, actually, this is a tough fight, we're losing people, we need to work out how to do this better.
I'm struck by conversations I've had with people in industry, because this is not just a military problem or a peculiarity to military headquarters. Reporting in industry, it can often go the same way, right? That people just want to please their bosses. They send them the good news. They think that the small problems won't grow and that they can be sort of mitigated or ameliorated at a lower level, that it's not worthy to bring these things up to a board level appreciation. And you see this in a number of industries where a number of companies have eventually gone down the pan. They've certainly come up against, major challenges because of this failure to report, the governance cycle being incorrect. And there are a myriad of cases that you can point to, even in political parties. The recent woes of the Scottish National Party in the UK. We're talking about this in June 2026, where there's embezzlement that went on of finances, claiming that it wasn't seen. There was a conspiracy of optimism, if you like, on behalf of society at that stage, just to believe that everything was all right in the party and the organisation of the finances, that all this could be explained. But it is somewhat more serious and peculiar in militaries. Is there a certain facet of military culture that makes this more likely? Is it something that is different to civil society and industry? Is there something special about the military and the conspiracy of optimism?
I don't know. I think it's an aspect of human nature. I think it's evident across industries. I think it's more apparent within the military because the costs are so great. And when you lose a military conflict, then it's lives lost, people die. And so it's quite apparent and quite measurable. But I think it's inbuilt in human nature that if you want to get promoted, the goal is be like your boss and report positive information up. Everything's fine. Everything's going well. We're all good. And I think you see that consistently. But you also see it at the individual level as well. And I think there's a great analogy with, the TV show Grand Designs, where you look at how many series they've had, and this is people going to set up their dream home, and series after series, episode after episode, it's always over budget and over time because they're incredibly over optimistic. They just wish away challenges. And that's at that individual level with something they're doing. So I do think it's inbuilt in human nature. And if you go back to ancient accounts of warfare, hubris and overconfidence are just continually warned against in these texts. So I don't think it's necessarily peculiar to the military. I just think it's more apparent when you have things that go wrong, because all of a sudden it's quite apparent. The reporting in Vietnam up to the Tet Offensive, things are going well. And then you had the Tet Offensive, which they talk about being a tactical victory for the US, but a strategic failure because the reality was so different. The Viet Cong could launch this major attack on cities and be broadcast across US televisions, which was an entirely different narrative to what had been being presented by the government and through the military. It was such a disconnect. And so that's quite apparent. But I do think this is something we do see consistently. And the military recruits out of society. And so we see this in society. We see this in the military. So I think it's also probably a coping mechanism as well for people. When it all gets too much, then an optimistic outlook is probably something we default to. I guess the other downside is when we start defaulting to a pessimistic outlook, we end up with major societal issues as well.
But as we look at all the military campaigns, particularly since, say 1970, there aren't many examples we can point to where we haven't had this optimism bias, where there's been a sort of gritty reality check that is reported honestly up, that politicians and leaders accept. They don't get shocked when they walk into theatre and they go, oh my God, this is so different from what I'd heard about or what I expected. There aren't more than a handful of those. So there is clearly an issue that still exists, but we know how to overcome this. It's within social sciences literature, within expert advice. There are people who can tell you how you stop having delusions of adequacy and an optimism bias. We know how to do that in headquarters, right? You point to some of these factors in the article.
Yeah, but it takes time, it takes effort. And I think leaders have to actively seek out those alternative perspectives. They have to reward those alternative perspectives. They have to encourage those alternative perspectives that provide that different source of information that say, well, actually, things aren't going right. They have to be open and willing to question. And that has to be the accepted mode. Historically, that has occurred. And the example I pointed to was in the lead up to D-Day, when Eisenhower, one of the US majors who engaged with Eisenhower when he and his entourage were coming round and talking to everybody before D-Day kicked off in the months leading up. And he said, look, dealing with Eisenhower was an exercise in leadership. Eisenhower presented the plan to these officers and then opened it up for questions. Took questions, answered questions. And the major made the point. He said nobody was too junior and no question was too irrelevant. Eisenhower answered them all. But that's comfortable with the plan and that's a willingness. It's also was particularly good because, hey, let's identify the weaknesses early. And I think that's one of the important aspects is you've got to develop an environment where the questions can be asked and raised and pursued, because what you're trying to do is build a better plan or achieve a better outcome. If you can't handle questions from inside your headquarters or inside your own ranks, if they're seen as unacceptable or uncomfortable, then you're kind of missing the opportunity, because the next series of feedback you get might be from an adversary who's taking advantage of the very weaknesses and problems that your own side would have been pointing out and asking. So I think it's hard work. Also, thinking about it now, I compare it, I'd say, a little bit like logistics. It's never solved. It's a constant thing. And I think the over-optimism and this optimism bias is a constant challenge. So it's not solved at one point. It's a constant thing that leaders have to actively encourage, because situations change. It's not like we've done this. It's a bit like red teaming. You do red teaming. Okay, we've done red teaming, so situation's good. We understand it. Well, no, red teaming helps, but it's no guarantee. You need to keep on questioning and challenging prior to, during, and hopefully after the operation as well. But it does take effort, and I guess it's a constant shift. Out of interest, last week we had Senate estimates here in Australia. So we had our senior military officers appear before Senate, which is our upper house, and asked a series of questions. And our current chief of Air Force actually highlighted a situation of, to quote him, optimism bias within the Air Force. And he was asked about why is it that Air Force flying hours have decreased so much. He said, we've got to this year and it looks like we're going to be decreasing, for some platforms up to 25%. And his answer was, actually, what I've done is I've stepped in and we've had to remove the optimism bias because our previous few years we've been overestimating how many flying hours that we would achieve on our platforms. So here's the most senior officer in the Air Force having to step in and say, no, what we need to do is be accurate, not simply overestimate what these flying hours are going to be. And you think about that from an operations analysis perspective, that's a simple problem. What did we fly last year? What did we estimate? What's the gap? What about the year before? What did we fly? What was our overestimation? Okay, let's present a realistic assessment. That's information, that's a system, that's a process you have control over. There's no bullets flying or anything like that. And the concern watching that is, from an operations analysis point of view, you've got the data, that's simple, and yet we still had this optimism bias, and we still had to have the most senior person in Air Force step in to say, no, we want to go with accuracy for our assessments going forward. So I think it's a constant challenge. I'll highlight something else that I was encouraged about. We had an Australian Deputy Chief of Army, Chris Smith, and there's a 30-minute video it's available online. He gave a speech to the Chief of Army's history conference last year. It's on YouTube. And he just talked about one of the things we need to do is use plain language. He said we need to get rid of managerial terms out of the army, but out of the military, and actually say what we are going to do. We're going to fight to win. We're not going to introduce all these managerial terms. And I think things like that are important. What are you actually saying? Say it clearly. And I think that's where the military can do really well. What is it you mean? Let's all understand it. Let's not adopt all of these other terms or buzzwords from outside industry. Let's talk about what the military does. It fights to win. And I thought that by Deputy Chief of Army was another good effort at trying to make sure that you are dealing in the reality of the situation. But again, that's a constant fight. And if those at the top are, having to fight it, I think it highlights that it is a battle to get the truth, to get up to the top, to make sure people know that they can speak the truth to power, and that's actively encouraged.
I'm struck by the idea that commanding officers, whenever they change over and come in, usually come up with this phrase, my door is always open, which to many people is, enough to answer this claim of, if you think I'm doing it wrong, come and see me, come and tell me, I want to know this stuff. But genuinely, that's just not enough. And actually, it doesn't underpin the idea, as you point out in the article, that you need to make the incentives for reporting bad news greater than the incentives for reporting good news. If the commander actually wants to know what the reality is, he needs to hear almost more of the bad news than he does of the good news, right?
I think encouraging it is helpful. I don't think you want to be swamped with bad news or good news. I think what you're aiming for is to live in and deal in reality. The open door, I've always got an open door. The problem with that is, and research suggests it doesn't work, because for somebody to go and visit the general, they have to walk past how many other people to get in there. Everybody knows that potentially junior person is going straight there, it actually creates issues. What the research suggests is actually the senior leader needs to go out and meet with the people where they are, where they're comfortable, to say, hey, boss, this is the situation. This is what we're seeing. So it's on the leadership to get out there to meet people where they are and where they feel comfortable, because there is such a rank imbalance and there's such a challenge anyway. So I think it is about moving forward, it's about pushing forward, it's about leaning forward rather than waiting for things to come to you. It's about actively going out and seeking that information in ways that people are going to engage. So the open door, I think, just doesn't really work in practice. I think what I'd emphasise is that issue about reality is that it's not overly positive news, it's not overly negative news. It's how do we get the reality of a situation? You know, that's what intelligence officers look for. What is the actual reality beyond words? What are the actions? What do we actually look through? And one of the aspects I think that is good for leaders at any level to do is they get briefings. There's always concerns about senior officer fascination devices, you know, these kind of things that flick up on slides and machines that go bing and all of those kind of things. It's like one of the aspects that I kind of looked at post the article is this powerful words of show me, show me, show me it working, take me to where it is, show me it in action, show me it in the field, show me the reality. And I think that show me is so important. It gets beyond the vaporware and words to actually, what is it that we've actually got? What is it that we can actually do? And I think in an information overloaded environment, I think that's really important. It's not just taking things at face value. It's when people go, hey, show me, it's like, well, okay, the boss is serious. They actually want to know. And I think that invites that reciprocation of, well, you wanted to see it. Here's what it actually looks like. It's not quite as good as the glossy brochures, but actually it still does this well. And I think that is part of that way of getting me closer to the reality. And the other thing I'd say is, for a military force that deals in reality, you think about that from an opponent's perspective. If you went up against a military who is dealing in reality, making their decisions based on their actual capabilities, what they can do, that's a pretty formidable opponent, and that's a pretty formidable deterrent.
One of the things that is evident from looking at all these campaigns and reflecting on this conversation is the point about commanders who think, right, and create themselves thinking time. So it's not just the going out and the show me, it's those who have the ability to sit in silence, in doodle, in read a book, and allow their subconscious to work to come up with some of these plans that start to understand the reality, to overcome the optimism, to reflect on what they're hearing, and to create that. In the academic world, you know, even in the business world now, this is called the attention economy, right? The idea that you are not distracted by things that go ping, by dashboards and endless presentations, that you have time to reflect, consider, is one of those things that happened in 1982, where we're holding up as a good example of where military commanders escaped the optimism bias in the process they had before. That's no self-delusion. The fact that they were en route south, there was no TV, there was not real-time signals, there was no Merc or chat functions that they were dealing with. There was just going out, seeing people, seeing ships, and then spending time thinking about the campaign, thinking about the adversary, thinking about what they were capable of. Was one of those moments where you get to this idea that we can think and create space for thinking. And yet the narrative about command and control today is about speed. It's about you won't have time to think. You need to do these things so fast that the only time for thinking is prior to a campaign. Do you think that we've lost some of that worthiness of thinking that Jim Mattis and others talked about? The idea that he would take a small library with him to reflect and use his time to think, consider, spend time allowing his subconscious to work to overcome these things. Is there something in that? Do you think we're in trouble with this obsession with speed?
I think we're in trouble with the distraction that systems and tools and apps and everything throw at us. And I think if things are going to move as quickly as people argue, then prior to, as you point out, is the thinking time. Well, we better be doing some pretty deep thinking right now if we're just going to have to react. I don't think and this is my personal opinion, yes, there will be speed, and they talk about things happening in seconds and microseconds. But if you look at any conflicts that are going on currently, they seem to take a while. They're certainly going on longer than the belligerents expected and planned. And so there was a former colleague of mine talked about what happens after the 10 minutes of terror. So the conflict isn't finished then. I don't think things are decided as quickly as we might anticipate. And I think in that, we're probably a bit over-optimistic about how quickly things can be decided when we have humans on the other side who are just not necessarily going to accept that you've decided it's over, so it's over. Not with some of the potential adversaries that we face going forward. I think thinking time is critical, but I think the distraction, the speed is always going to be fundamentally important. So we can also be spending time thinking about how we're going to use speed, because if you're thinking about red force versus blue force, how do we impose issues on the adversary by moving quickly and denying them the time to think? And then you just reverse that engineering and say, well, okay, so if they're going to deny us the time to think, how do we counter that? How do we give ourselves more time to think? I think thinking is highly underrated. And the time for thinking, I think, is invaluable. I wrote this article because I was, at the time, a part-time academic and I had time to think. And I think having that time and setting aside that time is really invaluable without distraction. The problem is that too much of what we think is thinking time is actually just scrolling on a computer and having Google stealing more of our time through distraction. So we don't have that dedicated thinking time. I would argue we're in the age of cyber warfare and we're in the age of hypersonic missiles and all of that. But I would argue, even in this day and age, that the time to think and the investment of thinking is fundamentally important because it gets to mindset. And when we're talking about super expensive weapons and we're talking about speed and we're talking about high-end conflict, actually one of the most powerful approaches is a change in mindset. And you can only do that by thinking and being confronted and being challenged and being willing to ask deep questions. Why? Why not? What if? I think that mindset change is so fundamentally important because what you have already can be used in a better way. And I go back to World War II, and there is a great book that the British government put out after World War II. I think it was 1947. It's called Science at War. And it looked at a whole bunch of aspects of this kind of breakthrough of science, but also operations research. That's really where operations research, operations analysis really came to the fore and was established in the UK and the US. And one of the arguments this publication made was actually what was often required was better use of what we already had rather than just waiting for new weapons. And I think how can we use what we've already got is a great way of thinking and spending time considering that. And it's often just better use of what you have rather than, oh, it's new, how can we do this? And I think throughout history, it wasn't necessarily big forces, it was the better forces that won. And they didn't have to have greater numbers, they just had to be better coordinated and use what they had more effectively.
Charles, thanks for coming on the show, reprising that 2019 article. We'll stick a link to that article in the show notes. And we'll also put the link out on Christmas speech at the Army History Conference about language, because it is something that's worthy of checking out and listening to. And I look forward to speaking to you again come September as your new book comes out for a conversation I think the audience will really enjoy. Over the summer of 2026, and I use summer in a Northern Hemisphere term, starting later this month, we're going to run a mini series of the show looking specifically at the future of US military command and control, not simply by going over JADC2 or CJADC2, but rather by talking about each fighting service of the US military. Hold on to your hats for a bit of a roller coaster as the US Army, Navy, Marines and Air Force, as well as a special episode on the future of battlefield health and how C2 of that joint function fits in too. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do hit the like or subscribe buttons. Thanks for listening.